1850. Jim Bridger, grizzled mountain man, strolled toward Lakota warriors like it was a Sunday picnic. The U.S. Army froze, expecting a bloodbath. They didn't know Bridger's secret. He'd faced worse odds and won with words, not bullets. This wasn't just a standoff, it was 19th century diplomacy with a side of swagger. Using broken Lakota and hand signs, he turned trackers into chuckling guests. Think of it as defusing a bomb with a campfire story. How did he pull it off? In 1850, Jim Bridger, a weathered mountain man with 25 years of roaming the untamed West, signed on with the U.S. Army's Corps of Topographical Engineers under Captain Howard Stansbury. The mission, a 16-man expedition to survey the Great Salt Lake, map the Mormon and Oregon trails, and scout a path for the Transcontinental Railroad. Bridger was the obvious choice. His name was practically a synonym for the frontier. He'd trapped beaver, dodged arrows, and charted paths where maps didn't exist. But this job? It felt like babysitting. The soldiers, green as spring grass, stumbled through the Rockies like they'd never seen a mountain. Bridger, at 46, was already over it, grumbling he'd never guide the army again. Spoiler, he lied to himself. The expedition's first leg was a slog. Stansbury's men, more scholars than survivalists, leaned on Bridger's instincts to navigate the jagged terrain around the Great Salt Lake. He led them through sagebrush and scree, pointing out shortcuts that had been second nature to trappers for decades. But the constant need to corral these pilgrims wore him down. He'd spent a quarter-century outsmarting blizzards and war parties, not playing nursemaid to men who couldn't tell a ridge from a ravine. By the time they wrapped the initial survey, Bridger swore off army gigs, his patience as thin as the Wyoming wind. Yet, come fall, he was back with Stansbury, unable to resist the pull of the wild. This second trip aimed to pinpoint a railroad crossing over the Continental Divide, a route now called Bridger Pass, 20 miles southwest of Rawlins, Wyoming. The journey stirred ghosts. One night, they camped 2 miles from where Bridger's old friend Henry Frabe fell to Lakota warriors years before. The next day, they passed a spot where Bridger's business partner, Vasquez, and 14 traders fought a grueling hours-long skirmish with the same tribe. The land itself seemed to whisper warnings. Bridger ordered the soldiers to keep rifles ready, his eyes scanning the horizon. He wasn't just guiding, he was reading the landscape like a book he'd written himself. Every ridge, a chapter of survival. As they pushed east toward Cheyenne Pass, Bridger's instincts prickled. Shadows moved on the hills, Lakota trackers, silent and watching. The soldiers tensed, hands twitching toward triggers. Most guides would have signaled retreat or prepared for a fight. Bridger did neither. At 46, his days as a fur trader were done, his legend built on split-second decisions. He'd taken arrows in the back before, nearly died in ambushes, but he knew this moment called for talk, not war. The Lakota respected him, called him Chief of the Blankets for his trading days. Some even feared the man who seemed to cheat death as easily as he breathed. Bridger shouldered his rifle not to aim, but to signal. Kalman walked toward the warriors alone. The army held its breath, expecting a bloodbath. He gestured for the Lakota to approach. They did, revealing themselves as Oglala and Cheyenne. Bridger invited them to camp, a move as bold as it was reckless. Horses thundered in, hands were shaken, and goods swapped. Then came the real magic. Bridger, using a patchwork of Lakota, Cheyenne, and sign language, spun tales that had the warriors doubled over with laughter. Picture it, hardened plains fighters, men who lived by the spear, cackling like kids at a storyteller's feet. By dawn, the threat was gone, replaced by a fleeting truce. This wasn't just luck. Bridger's life was a masterclass in reading people, as well as he read trails. He knew when to run, when to fight, and when to talk. That day, talk won. The expedition reached Fort Laramie without a shot fired. Their path now etched into history, as the overland trailer route mountain men and tribes had known for years. But one the army could now claim. Bridger's job was done, but his reputation grew. He wasn't just a guide. He was a one-man diplomatic corps. turning enemies into allies with a story and a handshake. A year later, in 1851, Bridger returned to Fort Laramie for a gathering unlike any other, the Horse Creek Treaty. It was the largest assembly of Native American tribes in recorded history to that point: Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, Hidatsa, Mandan, Arikara, Arapaho, and Shoshone, all converging on the plains. The air buzzed with tension and possibility. Bridger was there not just as a guide but as a protector of his Shoshone in-laws' interests, escorting their leader, Chief Washakie, himself. The treaty aimed to secure peace and safe passage for settlers on the Overland Trail, but for Bridger, it was personal. His wife's people, the Shoshone, needed a voice in a world where promises were often broken. The treaty grounds were a spectacle. Thousands of warriors, families, and horses sprawled across the valley. Negotiations dragged, with each tribe staking claims to land and honor. Bridger moved among them, his presence a bridge between worlds. He'd married into the Shoshone, lived their ways, and earned their trust. Washakie leaned on him, knowing Bridger's word carried weight. The talks weren't just about borders. They were about survival in a West where wagon trains and railroads were carving new scars. Bridger's role wasn't to grandstand, but to listen, translate, and nudge toward peace. His stories from the trail, laced with humor, eased tensions, reminding everyone that survival often meant sharing the land, not spilling blood over it. The Horse Creek Treaty wasn't perfect. Promises of peace and payments to tribes would fray over time, as they always did. But for a moment, Bridger stood at the heart of it, a mountain man turned mediator. He'd seen the West's beauty and brutality, from Frabe's death to Vasquez's firefight. He knew the stakes. The army saw him as a guide. The tribe saw him as something more, a man who spoke their languages, not just with words, but with respect. That respect, hard-earned over decades, was why warriors laughed at his stories instead of drawing bows. Bridger's work in 1850 and 1851 marked a shift. His fur trading days were over, replaced by a new role, guiding the army and brokering uneasy truces. He wasn't perfect. His frustration with the army's incompetence boiled over, and he'd made enemies in his time. But his ability to navigate both the land and its people set him apart. The Overland Trail and Horse Creek Treaty weren't just milestones. They were proof that one man's nerve could rewrite a moment's outcome. Bridger didn't just survive the West, shaped it, one bold gamble at a time. By 1852, Jim Bridger was more than a mountain man. He was a father betting on his kid's future. That summer, he packed Felix and Mary Josephine off to a Catholic school in St. Louis, far from the frontier's edge. The Mormons were stirring trouble, their land disputes and power plays threatening violence. Bridger, ever practical, saw education as a shield against the West's chaos. St. Louis, with its orderly streets and stern nuns, was a safer bet than the Wyoming wilds for his mixed-race children. Soon after, Bridger moved his whole family to Westport, Missouri, today's Kansas City. It was a pivot from trailblazing to building roots, or as close as he could get. In winter 1853, he sent daughter Virginia to join her siblings in St. Louis, doubling down on safety. Westport buzzed with wagon trains and traders, a goldmine for a man like Bridger. With his partner Vasquez, still smarting from losing Fort Bridger to Mormon pressures, he bought land outside town. They planned a new trading post along the Santa Fe Trail, sniffing profit in the air. The gamble worked. Bridger's knack for reading people turned into business savvy. He opened a general store at 504 Westport Road, stocking it with flour, tools, and guns for travelers and locals. The place hummed, a lifeline for those crossing the plains. Today, that building, possibly Kansas City's oldest, Bridger Westport, a hip-hop club where beats echo over floors that once held whiskey barrels. Back then, it was Bridger's foothold, proof he could master commerce as well as canyons. He and Vasquez thrived, their pockets as heavy as their ambitions. That same year, Bridger rode to Washington, D.C., with broken hand Fitzpatrick, likely to settle frontier claims or push trade deals. The trip's outcome is lost to history's haze, but it showed Bridger playing a bigger game, swapping trails for talks with bureaucrats. Back in Westport, he balanced family and frontier. His Shoshone wife, Mary, navigated a strange world, far from her people's lands. Their mixed-race children were a bridge between cultures, but the West's pull kept Bridger restless. In 1856, Bridger's life took a darker turn. He may have sent his youngest, 4-year-old John, to St. Louis for school, hoping to secure the boy's future. But the frontier beckoned, and Bridger joined Sir St. George Gore's hunting expedition, already underway since 1855. Gore, an Irish baron, was a walking caricature, demanding, extravagant, and obsessed with killing. Bridger, in his second season guiding this circus, was fed up. The baron's endless demands and lazy habits, sleeping till noon, clashed with Bridger's lean, no-nonsense style. Leading Gore's massive caravan through Wyoming's plains tested his patience like never before. Then, tragedy struck. Word came that John had died in St. Charles, taken by dysentery. The loss hit Bridger like a rifle's recoil. He abandoned Gore's expedition, leaving the baron's wagons and whims behind. He rode back to Westport, where his family waited, grieving. The frontier had given Bridger wealth and legend, but it couldn't shield him from loss. His store and land offered stability, yet the West's call lingered. Bridger's life in these years was a balancing act: family, business, and a doomed hunt that ended in heartbreak. In summer 1855, Jim Bridger signed on to guide Sir St. George Gore, an Irish nobleman with a fortune and a bloodlust to match. The expedition, launched that year, was less a hunt than a massacre. Gore aimed to kill every beast in sight: 30,000 buffalo, thousands of deer and elk, over 100 grizzly bears, all for sport. Bridger's job was to lead this traveling carnival through Wyoming's plains, keeping Gore's oversized ego and undersized morals alive. Native agents protested the slaughter, begging Washington to intervene. The government yawned. The West was a free-for-all, and Gore was just the loudest gun in the chaos. Bridger, a man who'd lived by the land's unwritten rules, gritted his teeth. Gore's men drove buffalo straight to his rifle, or he'd stand on a hill mowing down herds like a bored king. The carnage wasn't hunting, it was annihilation, piling up carcasses faster than the plains could rot. Bridger, who trapped only what he needed, saw the waste for what it was: a rich man's tantrum. Still, he kept the expedition moving, dodging trouble with the same instincts that had outwitted Lakota trackers. The job stretched into 1856, but Bridger's heart wasn't in it. He'd leave before it ended, called back by tragedy. When Gore's blood-soaked tour finally wrapped in 1857, Bridger pivoted to a different mission. Geologist Ferdinand Hayden and topographer Governor K. Warren hired him to explore the Yellowstone River, mapping its uncharted reaches and collecting geological samples. This suited Bridger better: less slaughter, more sense. He guided them through rugged valleys, his memory a living map of terrain last seen by Lewis and Clark. Hayden and Warren bickered, nearly trading punches over some scholarly spat, but Bridger kept them on track. His dry wit probably saved more than the expedition's timeline. The Yellowstone secrets spilled open, and Bridger's legend grew sharper. By 1857, Utah was a powder keg. Brigham Young, the Mormon leader, ruled Salt Lake City like a prophet with a vendetta, preaching defiance and dreaming of a theocratic kingdom. His sermons calling federal officials damned rascals rattled President Buchanan, who appointed Alfred Cumming, a non-Mormon, as Utah's new governor. Young wouldn't bend, so Buchanan sent an army to enforce the switch, with Bridger as their guide. The Mormons' fight for independence wasn't hard to grasp. They'd been chased across the country for their beliefs, their faith, a target in a nation split over slavery. Most Americans agreed on one thing: Mormons were trouble. Bridger, married to a Shoshone and friend to men of all stripes, likely saw the irony. Freedom came with a cost out west. The Utah War was more farce than fight, dubbed Buchanan's Blunder by a snickering nation. In the 18th of July 57, Colonel Edwin Alexander's army marched from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, far too late in the season. Bridger led them through Wyoming's South Pass and down the Mormon Trail, aiming for Salt Lake City, 400 miles away. They hoped to arrive by October, but Mormon resistance, mostly harassment, not bloodshed, stopped them at Ham's Fork, 150 miles short. Young had declared martial law, his followers buzzing with talk of liquid fire, a fantastical weapon straight out of some frontier fever dream. Bridger, no stranger to tight spots, suggested a detour northwest to the Bear River, along the Oregon Trail into modern Idaho, then south to Salt Lake from the north. Alexander, spooked by Mormon ambushes, agreed. The detour doubled their travel time, and then winter pounced. A brutal blizzard pinned the army down for 10 days, supplies running low, morale lower. Bridger scrambled to keep the men from freezing or starving, his knowledge of shelter and rationing their only shield. When Colonel Johnston took command, it was too late. Winter had won. Mormon raids on supply lines bled the army further, their guerrilla tactics more annoying than deadly. The expedition stalled, a costly flop. In the 18th of September 57, as Bridger guided the army, a Mormon militia attacked a wagon train, massacring over 120 men, women, and children. Only 17 children under 7 were spared. No hard proof tied Young to the slaughter, but his fiery calls for blood atonement set a dangerous tone. The nation recoiled, but the war fizzled. When the army finally neared Salt Lake, Young stepped down, handing power to Cumming. The Mormons kept local control but lost federal clout. Bridger, trudging through snow and sabotage, likely smirked at Young's fall. He'd seen worse odds and walked away, but this time, the West laughed last. In 1857, while Jim Bridger was guiding federal troops through Utah's chaos, a darker chapter unfolded at his Westport home. A census from 1855 had recorded a 20-year-old enslaved woman and her 2 children living there, under the household of Ruth Skaggs, a widow who managed the place alongside Bridger's Shoshone wife, Mary, and their children. By 1857, a transaction marked Bridger's name, $420, for the sale of an enslaved person. In 1861, a black woman, possibly the same, received medical treatment at his home. The details are murky, like a trail lost in fog. Did Bridger own slaves, or was he merely a conduit for his partner Vasquez, a known slaveholder? History doesn't let heroes off easy, and Bridger's no exception. This was the 1850s, a nation tearing itself apart over slavery, and even mountain men couldn't escape its stain. Bridger's life complicates the narrative. His wife, Mary, a Shoshone woman, spoke little English and longed for her people's lands near Fort Bridger. His mixed-race children straddled worlds, and his friends like Jim Beckworth, a former slave-turned-frontiersman, spanned every shade of the West's diversity. Bridger's actions suggest a man less bound by the era's prejudices. By the Civil War, he'd served the Union, as would his son and son-in-law, while neighbors in Missouri fought for the Confederacy. If Bridger had strong feelings about slavery, they didn't survive in ink. He likely saw it as another ugly fact of life, like blizzards or ambushes, something to navigate, not champion or condemn. History's messy, and Bridger's story is no clean legend. The slavery question lingers because it's uncomfortable. Mountain men like Bridger are often painted as solitary heroes, living free in the Rockies. But some, including Vasquez, kept enslaved people working their camps. Bridger's role in that 1857 sale might have been a favor for Vasquez, managing business while he was away. Or maybe it was just commerce, the kind of deal that kept Westport's economy humming. Either way, it's a reminder that even the West's icons walked in moral gray zones. The good, the bad, and the ugly don't just coexist, they're braided together, tighter than a rawhide knot. In 1859, Bridger left Westport's shadows for the Yellowstone River's headwaters, hired by the U.S. Army to guide Captain William F. Reynolds' expedition. The mission mapped the uncharted lands of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers, last seen by Lewis and Clark over 50 years earlier. They were also tasked with scouting wagon routes through the Powder and Bighorn regions, deep in Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho territory. with a chilling subtext: find paths to invade their country and subdue them. Bridger, at 55, knew these lands like his own pulse. His decades of trapping had etched every pass and riverbend into his memory. But Reynolds, a by-the-book officer, trusted his maps over the old trapper's instincts, setting the stage for a clash of egos. From the start, Reynolds' decisions grated. Bridger pushed for mules, suited to the Rockies' brutal terrain, but the captain insisted on wagons, which bogged down in gullies and forced the men to hack out paths. Time and again, Reynolds proposed routes, only for Bridger to correct them, pointing out cliffs or quagmires the maps ignored. The expedition crawled, frustration mounting like snow on a peak. Bridger's patience, honed by years of outwitting nature and warriors, held firm, but you can imagine his eyes rolling as Reynolds clung to his paper plans. The West didn't care about ink, it rewarded those who read the land itself. Winter hit hard, and with it, personal tragedy. Bridger learned his third wife, Mary, had died in Westport. She was buried in their front yard, a Shoshone woman laid to rest far from her homeland. Ruth Skaggs stepped in to care for Bridger's younger children, now motherless. At 55, Bridger was a widower, his life's anchor gone. He didn't remarry, perhaps because the frontier had claimed too much of him already. He returned to his family briefly, but duty called him back to the trail, leaving Westport's grief for the Yellowstone's challenges. By spring 1860, Bridger rejoined Reynolds near Fort Laramie, guiding the expedition west toward the Wind River. Reynolds, stubborn as ever, ignored Bridger's advice again, nearly freezing the men in a poorly chosen camp. Repeated attempts to cross the Continental Divide failed, the captain's routes blocked by snow or cliffs. Finally, Reynolds relented, following Bridger's lead to Union Pass, a route the mountain man knew would work. The victory was bittersweet. Bridger's expertise was undeniable, but the delays cost them dearly. The Snake River brought more trouble. Swollen with snowmelt, it roared like a living thing. Bridger proposed a bulbo at a lightweight frame of willow wrapped in fresh buffalo hide, a trick he'd learned from trappers and tribes. Reynolds scoffed, ordering his men to find a ford instead. The result was disaster. A corporal was swept away, his body lost to the current. Undeterred, Reynolds doubled down, demanding a wooden raft. It failed, sinking under the river's weight. 2 days wasted, one man dead, and Reynolds finally turned to Bridger. The bullboat, 12.5 feet long and 3.5 feet wide, was built in hours. It crossed the Snake 17 times, each trip taking 2 minutes, carrying the expedition safely to the other side. Bridger's triumph was practical, not showy. He led the men through Teton Pass to Pierre's Hole, reaching Fort Benton by the 3rd of July, 1860. They never made it to what's now Yellowstone National Park, but Bridger's guidance ensured they survived the journey. Reynolds' maps were no match for the mountain man's memory, which held the West's secrets like a living archive. The expedition mapped new routes, but it was Bridger's cool head that kept it from unraveling. He'd faced worse than stubborn officers, Lakota war parties, blizzards, and now personal loss. Yet he kept moving, a man who knew the cost of every step. In 1860, the world scoffed at tales of Yellowstone's wonders. Boiling mud, steaming rivers, glass mountains, and petrified trees with petrified birds singing petrified song-spear nonsense to city folk. Native tribes had described these marvels to Lewis and Clark decades earlier, but the explorers never saw them. John Coulter, a trapper, stumbled on a geothermal spring in Yellowstone's northeast, dubbing it a place of fire and brimstone. The name stuck, Coulter's Hell. But Easterners dismissed it as a tall tale, the ravings of a wild man drunk on wilderness. Jim Bridger, no stranger to skepticism, leaned into the myth-making. He'd seen Yellowstone's bubbling pools and geysers himself, but when doubters smirked, he'd spin stories wilder than the land itself. Bridger's yarns were legendary. Picture him by a campfire, eyes glinting, recounting a siege by 100 Cheyenne, Lakota, or Blackfeet warriors. Trapped in a box canyon, out of bullets, he'd pause for effect. When asked what happened next, He'd deadpan. "Well, they killed me," the crowd roared. Another tale had him camping in a canyon where the echo lasted 6 hours. He'd shout, "Time to wake up!" at dusk, and the echo would rouse him at dawn. Then there was the Crow medicine man who cursed a valley, petrifying everything, even gravity. Bridger claimed he rode a horse across petrified air, only for the beast to show off, fall, and die. "Smart horse," he'd say. "Just didn't know gravity ain't petrified most places." To desk-bound skeptics, these were lies. To Bridger, they were the West's truth, stretched just enough to make you listen. These stories weren't just for laughs. Bridger used them like he used sign language with the Lakota tools to disarm, to connect. During Captain Reynolds' 1860 expedition, he diffused 2 potential clashes with native warriors, likely Cheyenne or Arapaho. Both times, he stepped forward, unarmed, weaving words and gestures to cool hot tempers. Bloodshed was avoided, not by force but by Bridger's knack for reading people as well as he read trails. Yellowstone's wonders, like his diplomacy, were real but exaggerated, waiting for the world to catch up. It wasn't until 1869, with the Cook, Folsom, and Peterson expeditions, that scientists confirmed the geysers, hot springs, and petrified trees Bridger had described. The mountain man wasn't a liar, he was just ahead of his time. By spring 1861, Bridger was in Denver, hatching a new plan with his old friend Jim Beckworth, a former slave-turned-mountain man. The fur trade was dead, beaver hats were out of fashion. But gold? That was the new frontier. Bridger and Beckworth figured their decades of roaming the Rockies gave them an edge. "Beaver was the best gold we ever chased," Bridger might have said, but the glitter of ore was tempting. They dreamed of rallying old trappers for a prospecting venture, betting their knowledge of hidden streams and valleys would outshine any greenhorn's luck. The West was changing, and even legends had to adapt. Before they could chase gold, Bridger took a job with a stagecoach and mail service. They hired him to map a direct wagon route from Denver west through the Rockies, shaving 200 miles off the Overland Trail. Bridger, who knew every pass from Wyoming to Montana, laid out a path that promised speed and profit. But the route never materialized. Bureaucracy, funding, or maybe just bad timing killed it. The dream of gold with Beckworth fizzled too, overshadowed by bigger events. The West wasn't just a land of opportunity, it was a land of interruptions. Gold fever hit hard elsewhere. In southwest Montana, prospectors struck pay dirt along Grasshopper Creek, birthing the boomtown of Bannock. 80 miles west, Alder Gulch sprouted Virginia City, another instant town fueled by glittering streams. This wasn't California's 1849 rush, but it was close. Miners flooded in, their wagon trains cutting through Sioux territory like a blade through flesh. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and their allies didn't take kindly to the invasion. They struck hard, ambushing caravans and shutting down the new Bozeman Trail, the shortest path to Montana's gold fields. The army, stretched thin by the Civil War, couldn't ignore the chaos. They called in Brigadier General Patrick Connor with orders to wage vigorous war on the tribes and punish them into peace. Bridger, nearing 60, was summoned to guide Connor's campaign. His body was weathered decades of frostbite, arrow wounds, and hard miles had taken their toll. Yet his mind was sharp, his knowledge of Lakota and Cheyenne lands unmatched. The army needed him to navigate the Powder River country, where warriors knew every ridge and gully. This wasn't diplomacy like Horse Creek or campfire tales with the Oglala. This was war, or close to it, and Bridger knew the stakes. The Lakota weren't just defending hunting grounds, they were fighting a tide of miners and soldiers that threatened their world. Bridger, who'd married into the Shoshone and called men like Beckworth brothers, walked a fine line. Loyalty to the army paid his bills, but his heart understood the tribe's defiance. The campaign loomed as a brutal test. Connor's orders were clear: crush resistance, secure the trails. Bridger's role was to lead, but at 60, could he still outpace danger? The Powder River was no place for a tired man. It was Lakota heartland, where warriors like Red Cloud were already drawing blood. Bridger's past talking down war parties. Outsmarting blizzards gave him a shot, but the odds were grim. The shadow of William J. Fetterman, a young officer whose fate would soon intertwine with the Bozeman Trail, hung over the horizon. Bridger's story was nearing its end, but the West's bloodiest chapters were just beginning. Bridger's Yellowstone Tales and Lakota talks shaped a brutal West. He walked a tightrope guide, diplomat, survivor never breaking. History's messy, and so was he. At 60, could he still outwit war? Comment your take, subscribe for more frontier stories, and bring grit next time.